The summer after my sophomore year of college, I did an internship at a newspaper in Kansas called the Salina Journal in Salina, Kansas. Go figure. And I'll never forget one of the stories that I was tasked with writing that summer was covering the senior games. It was this Olympic style event that came to Salina each year where senior athletes from around the state and sometimes around the country would come and participate in Olympic events or Olympic style events. And one of the stories that I was tasked with covering from my editor was I was going to go interview and do a story on this senior pole vaulter. He was in his 70s and he was one of the best senior pole vaulters in the nation, I believe. The details of that are inconsequential. So I went out to cover his pole vaulting event. He ended up winning, rightfully, or not rightfully so, but as expected. And I did the interview. I wrote the story. It ran in the paper on the front page of the sports section the next day. And a few days later, I got that article mailed to me from one of my professors at Kansas State, one of my journalism professors at Kansas State. His name was Ron Johnson. And I adored Ron. Ron taught me so much about effective writing and how to be a good journalist and interviewing. But he sent me this article in the mail. And my lead was circled. The lead is the opening paragraph or couple of paragraphs of the story. He had circled it in this bright red marker, and he had wrote off into the side of the column, "Michael, you're better than this. This is nothing but a cliche. Do better." Now, the article went something like this, or the lead went something like this. "Even at 75 years old, so-and-so is still soaring to new heights." I mean, I gag just thinking about it now. But Ron was absolutely right. It was a cliche. It was a throwaway. That could have been said about any senior pole vaulter in the country. There was nothing unique about my story and that opening line to my story that I had failed as a journalist. I had failed as a communicator. I had failed as a writer to appropriately tell his story in a way that hadn't been told before. But that's what we do when we fall back on cliches and jargon and forced humor at times. In particular, cliches and jargon. We're falling back on something that doesn't add to or advance our communication in any way. And that's what Ron was trying to tell me. I didn't take it as a slam of my work. He was trying to tell me, "Michael," and he wrote this, "you're better than this. Don't do this." Now, Ron, I credit him with my hatred of cliches. He hated cliches, and I hate cliches and jargon as well. And as a speaking and communications coach these days, I hear it and I see it all the time. We fall back on, so many folks fall back on cliches and jargon when we could be so much more effective and confident in our communication if we just found ways to remove those out of our language. Look, you wouldn't say those things to your spouse or to your best friend having coffee or a drink at night at a bar. Like, you wouldn't use cliches and jargon in those types of conversations. But for some reason, when we get on a stage or when we get in front of our company in a meeting or an all hands company meeting, or when we do a conference presentation, we just litter our communication with cliches and jargon and sometimes forced humor. And I'll touch a little bit on forced humor today, but it is another way that we undermine our credibility as a communicator and a speaker. So let's walk through, how do we remove cliches and jargon from our talk, from our speech, from our communication? Well, I already gave you the first piece of it. Talk or communicate like you actually talk or communicate. If you wouldn't say it to your best friend, your spouse, whomever, don't put it in just because of the circumstance that you're in. Now, I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. We often talk about in work meetings, out of the box thinking. Think outside the box when it comes to trying to think of, for me, I'm a marketing director at a software company. If I'm talking to my team, I don't say this, but if I possibly could. If I used cliches and jargon, I might say something like, hey, this next campaign, let's really think outside the box. Let's really shoot for the stars here. I'm not giving any sort of direction, any sort of compelling reason, or any sort of compelling motivation to my team if I'm using that, because there's no significance to that. It's a throwaway. Be mindful of how much we throw away our words in communication, in talks, in how we communicate with others, in conversation. So instead of saying, I really want us to think outside the box, what if I said something to the effect of, you know what would be great is if we approached marketing this product or this feature of our product as if we were children. You know, when we're kids, we think about and we pick up a stick out of the yard and suddenly it becomes a wand. Or we get a refrigerator box after our parents get a new refrigerator and it becomes a spaceship, or it becomes a log cabin. Let's think like that. Let's really tap into that kind of childlike creativity as we're planning this out. How can we do something different where we're looking at it through the eyes of a child? What do you think, team? Now, doesn't that give you more? And that's another point that I want to make here. When we can turn cliches into metaphors, like what I just did with that out-of-the-box thinking, we can set a direction for people. They come alongside us because they begin to create inside their head their own version of what this metaphor might look like. You know, for me, I used refrigerator boxes as, of course, spaceships, but I also stuck it on my little red wagon when I was younger, and it became this a truck. It became a truck because it was on two wheels. My sisters and I had a name for it. Let's just call it what it was. It was called the Fix It Up Chappie, and we rode that thing around our backyard and in the park that we lived right. Our backyard butted up to a park, and we would ride that thing around the park. And we would call it the Fix It Up Chappie. It had little side view mirrors that we made out of aluminum foil. And it was all of a sudden a vehicle for us. And one of us would have to, of course, pull it, but it was great. And we were using our imagination. Now, couldn't you think of something else from your childhood that you would have used that refrigerator box for? That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about using metaphors rather than cliches. Now, I just did something else there in telling you that story of the Fix It Up Chappie. I told a story. That's exactly what you want to do when you're communicating effectively and confidently. Stories always mean more. The stories that we can create to give context, to give meaning, to give emotion to what we're saying, they mean more if you are relaying firsthand knowledge of what somebody did or said or how they felt, perhaps in another conversation or perhaps in an experience that you had. But what I just told you is my childhood story of how my sisters and I used a cardboard box to become the Fix It Up Chappie. And you might have gotten a smile on your face. You might have imagined what that looked like as I described the aluminum foil side view mirrors. And of course, we had a windshield. Stories mean more. And when you can tell stories, and when you can use metaphors to set up those stories or use metaphors within those stories to explain what you mean in ways that are relatable more holistically to people, then you get away from cliches and jargon. All right? So let's tell stories more. Let's invite those in. Another story that I want to tell you is the story of my grandfather on my mom's side, my grandpa Ledke. He was an incredible gardener. He had corn. He had strawberries. My grandmother would make the most delicious strawberry jam in the summer. I remember going out into his vegetable garden and his garden where the strawberries were. He had chicken mesh wire laying over the strawberry plants to keep the rabbits out, but sometimes those rascally rabbits got inside that chicken wire, and so we had to scare them out so they wouldn't eat all the strawberries. But he had asparagus, he had broccoli, But what he was most proud of, and what I think I remember my grandfather's garden the most for, were his tomato plants. Rows of tomatoes and tomato plants that were 3 times as big as a small child. And just the biggest, reddest tomatoes that you could ever imagine. My grandmother would can those tomatoes, and they would have tomatoes for months after their garden had gone. So I always remember walking out in the vegetable garden with my grandpa. And one summer we were down there visiting. I don't think it was around the 4th of July, but it might have been. Inconsequential. But my grandpa and I were out in the garden, and he was showing me around. He was showing me the ears of corn. He was showing me the strawberries, of course. And we got to the tomatoes. And my grandpa, as we're walking up and down the tomato rows, he says, Michael, a tomato given to you will never taste as good as one that you grow yourself. And me being 8 or 9 years old and not really appreciating the full richness of a vegetable garden, I didn't like tomatoes. I said, Grandpa, I think all tomatoes are gross. I don't like them. I don't like any of them. And he laughed, and he kind of let it go at that point. He had said what he wanted to say, and we went about going through the rest of the garden. At some point, my grandma called us in for lunch and didn't think about it. Until years later, when I was driving to my grandfather's funeral on the back roads of Kansas, and those words came flooding back into my mind, as they do when you are recalling the life and the experiences that you've had with someone who's just passed away. I adored my grandfather. My grandfather is one of the greatest men that I will ever know. And I had a lot to think about in that drive to his funeral. But those words, a tomato given to you will never taste as good as one that you grow yourself, those hit me in that moment. And all of a sudden, I got this epiphany of sorts. My grandfather was not trying to tell me about growing tomatoes. He was trying to tell me about the value of hard work. It was my grandfather's way of sharing some wisdom with me that maybe I'll understand in that moment as a young boy, but certainly as a now 40-year-old man, I truly understand, having also grown tomatoes in my garden myself. He was telling me about the value of hard work and how taking a shortcut or taking the easy way out will never feel as good, will never be as valuable, will never be as rewarding as doing the fullness of that thing yourself. That's what my grandfather was trying to tell me. A tomato given to you will never taste as good as one that you grow yourself. Do the hard work yourself. And so for years, ever since then, I have one of these little mantras that I say to myself every so often that comes back and hits me every now and then. And that's grow your own tomatoes. That is my version of saying, Michael, do the hard work. It's going to be hard. It's going to take longer than you want, but the end will be rewarding and it will taste all the better if you do the hard work yourself. Now, there's some nuance to that. We can talk about receiving help and getting guidance and mentorship and all that stuff. But you get what I'm saying here. This is the next point of how to be a more effective and confident communicator and use less cliches and jargon. Create your own phrases. When you talk about those metaphors, when you talk about the stories that you tell, create your own phrases so that you don't have to use cliches and jargon. Isn't grow your own tomatoes and my explanation more interesting than, I don't know, the early bird gets the worm? That's the cliched version of that story that I just told you. But how much more meaning is there in my story of my grandfather and those tomatoes in that vegetable garden than me just throwing out and throwing away, oh, the early bird gets the worm. Same concept, same idea, but completely different effectiveness and effect emotionally on you. So create your own phrases. Come up with something that your lived experience that you can impart to others through the stories that you tell, through the metaphors that you create, that can ditch those cliches and that jargon. So we've talked about talk like you talk. Would I say this to my best friend or a significant other or somebody I'm really close with? We've talked about turning cliches into metaphors and using stories, that those always mean more, and how when you can create your own phrases, that can elicit a different kind of emotion than the cliches and the jargon that exist. Now, I said I was going to talk real quickly or real briefly about forced humor, and I do want to hit on that. But one more thing on this that I think is really, really powerful for us, and that is to be specific and clear, to not say more than is necessary. That's where we fall into a jargon and cliche mode when our mind is trying to think of all these different things that we could or should say. That's when we often default to these throwaway lines when we are trying to fill space. So if you can be specific and you can be clear and concise with what you're saying, then you can ditch the cliches and jargon. Here's an example. I call this the detail sprinkle method. And it's a download that you can get by subscribing to my newsletter. So go to michaelashford.com/newsletter, sign up there, and you can get a little worksheet that helps walk you through the detail sprinkled method. And what the detail sprinkle method is it's a way of building up the details of a story to the point where it finally resonates in a way that you want it to resonate. And I like to use one of my favorite movies as an example. So one of my favorite movies is Life as a House. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. Keep a box of tissues close. I cry every time that I watch Life as a House. So the detail sprinkle method says, take it down to its most basic form when you describe to me, in this instance, what this movie is about. So if I were to describe to you what Life as a House is about in as simple and basic a format as possible, here's what I would say. Life as a House is a movie about a father and a son who build a house together. That is as basic of an explanation of the movie as I can get. Now, the detail sprinkle method says, let's start layering on some sprinkles, just like you would on a sugar cookie. Let's throw a few sprinkles on there to pizzazz it up a little bit, right? Okay. So if I were to add a few sprinkles of detail, Life as a House is a movie about a father and a son who build a house together as a way to repair their estranged relationship. Okay. Now I'm getting a little bit more information here. I'm starting to feel maybe a little bit of the plot, maybe a little bit of the conflict, but not quite enough to really want to go, watch this movie, okay? So let's add one more layer of detail sprinkles here. Okay, Life as a House is a movie about a father and a son who build a house together as a way to repair their estranged relationship after the father discovers he's dying of cancer and he wants one thing to leave his son after he's gone, which is a house. Okay, you got me. I now know the conflict, the plot, how is it going to resolve? All of these things. Of course, there are so much to this movie that I didn't explain in those detail sprinkles. But that, if you are speaking on a stage, if you are giving a TEDx talk, if you are giving a conference presentation, if you are trying to elicit change out of your company or your organization, you don't need to, in the moment when you're in front of everybody, give all of the details all of the time. Sometimes you do. There's nuance to this. Sometimes, most of the time, you don't, because you want to invite in questions. You want to invite and pique people's curiosity to get ramped up. So what you just experienced with me and the detail sprinkle method was trying to get you to that point where I give you just enough that you say, oh, that sounds interesting. I do want to go watch that. So let me know, did you go and watch Life as a House? If you've seen it, did I explain it accurately? Let me know. You can send me an email, michael@rethinkingcommunication.com, or if you're watching this on YouTube, hit me in the comments. I'd love to know, did you go and watch Life as a House after I shared with you my detail sprinkle method about the movie? But that's what I'm talking about here. I was specific, I was clear, I was concise, and that's what that method is trying to get you to. And that brings about more effective, more confident communication. And I didn't have to use jargon and cliches. One last piece before I get into using humor. Dialogue. If you are telling a story of a conversation that you had with someone else, little meta here, dialogue is better than narrative. And what I mean by that is a lot of people will be on a stage or be in front of someone and say, so Michael said this. Michael said blah, 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 blah. And then I said blah, 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 blah. And then he said so and so and so and so. That's narrative. I'm just telling you as in a back and forth what happened there. But if I were to use dialogue, I change my voice, I change my body position, I change the tenor as I'm saying all these things. So let's go back to my example with my grandpa in the vegetable garden. My grandpa and I were walking down the rows of tomatoes, and all of a sudden my grandpa turns to me. Michael, you know, a tomato given to you will never taste as good as one that you grow yourself. Grandpa, I think all tomatoes are disgusting. All right, let's keep going. That's dialogue. Now, that's just a very short little snippet of dialogue, but it was effective. And if you're, again, watching this on YouTube, you could see I shifted my body position. I changed my facial expressions. That can be a really effective way to communicate. And when you use dialogue rather than narrative, you often get away from cliches and jargon as well. So be mindful of those places where you can use dialogue rather than narrative. All right, let's wrap this up with a talk about humor. Spontaneous humor is always better than forced. When we try and force humor, we always run the risk of thinking we're really funny and others not picking up on that at all. When it is spontaneous, when it is in the moment, when it is unplanned, it tends to go over well. It tends to be received as true humor rather than forced humor. It's really hard to make forced or planned humor come off as authentic. And so when you think about using humor in a talk or in a speech or in front of a company presentation or in a conference talk or presentation, be mindful of it, because it too can turn into cliches and jargon if you plan it, if it's not something that comes just naturally in spur of the moment. And that can take some time. I often coach and advise people, look, if you don't feel comfortable with humor, let's stay away from it. But if this is a point to interject some of your personality, some of your humor, some of your wit or sarcasm in here, as long as it can be received as such, that might be a great place to consider it. But feel the room out first. All right? All of these things are things that I've learned over the years as a speaker myself and a presenter and as a leader in various companies, as a director of marketing, as a communications expert. I've learned these things being on stages. I've learned these things doing presentations at conferences. But most of all, I credit this approach to not using jargon and cliches back to my journalism education, back to Ron Johnson and his red marker circling that story, saying you're better than this. And that's what I want to close this out with. You're better than cliches and jargon. You don't have to rely on those things to sound smart or to sound like you know what you're talking about or like an industry insider. Instead, connect with people using your stories, using your spontaneous humor, using your own phrases and metaphors that get the point across in your own unique and special way. You're better than this. You're better than cliches and jargon. And I hope this episode helped you see exactly how you can overcome that. So I want to thank you for listening or watching to this episode of Rethinking Communication. If you would ever like to get in touch with me, you can always go to my website, michaelashford.com, and reach out there. or you can always email me, michael@rethinkingcommunication.com. I will see you on the next episode. And until then, keep asking questions.